All right, welcome everyone. Why don't we get started? I'm going to turn it over to Annette to read the guidelines. So please go ahead, Annette.
All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation. We ask that you please do not unmute and mute yourself. To participate in the discussion, please use the raised hand function, sorry. You'll find this by clicking on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and then a window will pop up with a raise hand button at the bottom. The presenters will then call on participants and unmute their microphone. If you are on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. And if you have any technical difficulties at any time, please contact Roisin Foley via the chat box or rfoley, F-O-L-E-Y, @ctps.org, or by phone 857-702-3704.
All right, thanks, Annette. I'll read that accessibility statement. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, Level AA standards, and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Roisin Foley, MPO staff at rfoley, F-O-L-E-Y, @ctps.org, or 857-702-3704. All right, with that, we'll get into the agenda. First in the agenda, introductions. Who's handling the role? Is it going to be John? Jonathan?
I will be. Yep.
Go ahead, John.
Okay, Mass DOT Chair.
Steve Wolfel here.
Mass DOT Seat 2. Is John Bouchard here today?
Do not see him.
I doubt it.
Okay. Mass DOT Highway Division.
John Romano here.
Thank you. MBTA.
This is Samantha Silverberg from the MBTA.
Thank you. Massport.
Good morning. This is Laura Gilmore with the Massachusetts Port Authority.
Okay, great. MAPC.
Hello, this is Eric Barrasso with MAPC.
Great, thanks. I think Brian, MBTA Advisory Board. I think I saw Brian just enter the.
Jonathan, I am here. Thank
Okay.
you. I just wrapped up my meeting, so lots of folks should be coming in.
Okay, great. Thank you. Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Yeah, I was being held hostage by Mr. Kane, so I'm here now too.
Held on.
Wow.
Wow.
Off to a rough start this morning.
Okay, Leonard Dagan. Thank you, Leonard. City of Boston, BTD.
Tom Kadzis, representing Mayor Walsh from the City of Boston.
Thank you, Tom. City of Boston, BPDA.
Jim Fitzgerald with the BPDA representing Mayor Walsh, City of Boston.
Great, thank you. At-large City of Everett.
Jay Monty, representing Mayor DeMaria, City of Everett.
Great. At-large City of Newton.
David Kozas, at-large city, representing Mayor Ruth Ann Fuller in City of Newton.
Thank you. At-large Town of Arlington.
Daniel Amstutz, Town of Arlington, at-large town, representing Select Board Chair John Hurd and MPO area towns.
Great. At-large Town of Lexington.
This is Sheila Page, representing the Town of Lexington and all the MPO.
Great, thank you. Intercore Committee, City of Somerville.
Representing Mayor Joe Curtatone and the Intercore.
Great, thanks, Tom. Magic, Town of Acton. Okay. Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Patrick Keyser, representing Mayor Spicer, Framingham.
Thank you. North Shore Task Force, City of Beverly. Oh, looks like Darlene is just coming in. We'll come back. We'll come back to North Shore Task Force. North Suburban Planning Council. City of Woburn.
Good morning, Tina Cassidy, representing Woburn Mayor Scott Galvin and the Subregion North Suburban Planning Council.
Thank you. South Shore Coalition, Town of Rockland.
Jen Constable, Town of Rockland, representing South Shore Coalition.
Thank you. SWAP, Town of Medway. Okay. Trick, Town of Norwood, Neponset Valley Chamber of Commerce.
Oh, sorry. Good morning. Tom O'Rourke, Town of Norwood, representing Trick.
Thank you. I will go through the list one more time. MassDOT DOT seat number 2. I think I saw Marie Rose come in. I don't know if she's in place for.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Are you here for seat 2?
John Burchard, Deputy Chief Engineer. I guess I think that's seat 2.
Yes, it is.
It's one of the 2 seats. Sorry, I was just got off another meeting. Thank you.
That's okay. Thank you. North Shore Task Force, City of Beverly. I saw Darlene.
Darlene is here and unmuted, maybe having an audio issue.
Okay. And then I'll go into the ex officio members, Federal Highway Administration. Okay. And Federal Transit Administration. I believe that calls the roll, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Welcome again, everyone. So the next item on the agenda is the chair's report. I do not have one. So we're on to agenda item 3, which is it's the executive director's report. I know Tegan is out for part of this morning, so Annette has agreed to do that. So Annette, can you please give the executive director's report? Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to extend apologies from Tegan for not being able to be here to make the executive director's report. She has a conflict related to the beginning of the remote school year, which I'm sure some of you can appreciate. She did want you to know that she will be joining the meeting later this morning, and she'll mainly be in listening mode, but she will participate if needed. There are several topics that she asked me to cover. First is an update on the strategic plan. We'd like to thank the board members and other stakeholders who have agreed to be interviewed or been in a focus group related to CTPS's strategic planning process. Many of you have already participated, and we thank you all for the insight that you are providing to this process. Secondly, we'd like to highlight some of the ongoing outreach efforts that have happened since the last meeting. We finished up the scheduled outreach for the TIP criteria with a meeting with members of the Livable Streets Alliance on September 10th. Thank you to the City of Somerville for joining that conversation to talk about the MPO and to listen to participants' thoughts. We also attended 2 sub-regional meetings, one at SWAP and the other with the South Shore Coalition last week to hear about their priorities for the next fiscal year and to share information about the upcoming MPO elections. Then I'd like to move on to today's agenda. So we will be presenting an un-MPO funded work scope for your approval, and that's the Wellington Circle study, which you'll hear more about shortly. We're going to ask for your endorsement for UPWP Amendment 3. We will continue the discussion of the results of the test scoring for the TIP criteria and answer any remaining questions that you may have. We will also ask at that point whether you're ready to vote to approve the criteria or if you need more information. And then finally, Michelle, Scott, and Ben Muller will give a performance-based planning update. They will be presenting and discussing a proposed performance measure related to the congestion mitigation and air quality program. And then finally, I'll just give you highlights for next meeting. We will be presenting another non-MPO funded work scope, and that will be the MBTA Green Line Corridor Transformation Study. We'll follow up on the discussion about the major infrastructure definition that we've talked about in previous meetings. We will be providing a review of the Community Connections pilot program and talk about where we're going with that for next year. And then if necessary, we'll continue the TIP criteria discussion. That's all I have, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thanks, Annette. All right, so we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is public comments. Are there any members of the public who would like to address the MPO today? And please remember to identify yourself. We have anyone, Jonathan?
Seeing none.
All right, let's move on to agenda item 5, which is committee chairs reports. Are there any committee chairs? Oh, wait, Ben has a question. Raise his hand. Ben.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to report on the UPWP committee. We met this morning just before this meeting, discussed the amendment before you for endorsement, recommended the MPO endorse it. There was a pretty deep dive into the particular details there, so just know it's been well vetted. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben. All right, are there any other committee chair reports? All right, seeing none, we'll move on to agenda item 6, which is the Regional Transportation Advisory Council report. Leonard, go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. We had Ann McGann come and talk with us about the major infrastructure definition and policy changes proposal. And it was very, very fruitful, helpful conversation. So I once again thank the board for allowing us to have that meeting before making this decision of taking the final vote. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Leonard. All right, we're on to action item 7, which is approval of the MPO minutes of August 6th. Can I get a motion in a second? Please remember to identify what organization we are when you make your motion. Eric, go ahead.
This is Eric Barassa with MAPC, and I make a motion to approve the minutes.
All right, is there a second?
Yes, Tina Cassidy will second that.
Thank you, Tina. All right, any questions or comments on the minutes? All right, seeing none, Jonathan, you want to read the roll?
Sure. Stephen Wolfle?
Yes.
Marie Rose?
Approved.
Opposed?
Sorry. Aye.
Did you say opposed or?
No.
No.
What's yes mean?
Yes would be approval of the minutes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. John Romano?
Yes.
Samantha Silverberg?
Yes.
Laura Gilmore?
Yes.
Eric Barassa?
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane?
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins?
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kadzis?
Yes, Tom Kadzis.
Jim Fitzgerald?
Yes.
Jay Monty?
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis?
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz?
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Sheila Page?
Oh, Lexington, yes.
Thank you. Tom Bent?
Tom Bent, yes.
Thatcher Keyser?
Thatcher Keyser, yes.
Darlene Wynn?
Darlene Wynn, yes.
Tina Cassidy,
Tina Cassidy, yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. All right, so we're on to agenda item 8, which is an action item. It's the work scope for the Wellington Circle study. Sanjay, please go ahead and present.
Thank you and good morning to all. This effort on part of CTPS is in support of MassDOT's Wellington Circle study, which evolved from the local and regional planning processes stemming from the MIPA permitting process for Encore Casino, the Lower Mystic Regional Planning Study, and the Boston Region MPO's LRTP Needs Assessment Study. Given its location at the crossroads for several state highways, its proximity to several walk and bike trails, its proximity to MBTA's Wellington Transit Station, which is a junction for several bus routes, this is a complex transportation area that deserves a thoughtful reassessment of its transportation operations. This study will evaluate the existing and future multimodal transportation conditions at Wellington Circle by focusing on the redesign of Wellington Circle in the city of Medford in order to provide better connectivity and improve mobility throughout the area, including towns like Malden, Everett, and Somerville. As part of this study, alternatives intended to improve transportation conditions will be developed, analyzed, and evaluated to the extent possible in the context of vehicular, transit, bicycle, and pedestrian use. The study area looks like an inverted triangle with Mystic Avenue corridor on the west, the intersection of Fellsway and Pleasant Street on the north, the Northern Strand Community Trail and Broadway corridor on the east, and Route 99 and I-93 on the south. The objective for CTPS team is to provide project coordination and analytics support to MassDOT's project team. The coordination effort will include working with MassDOT, their consultants, and the project stakeholders. And the analytic support will include utilizing the travel demand model to produce forecasts of multimodal travel flows in the region for existing conditions, future no-build 2040 scenario, and up to 3 build alternatives. For our analysis, the base year will be year 2018. We'll start by calibrating and validating our base year model to best reflect the specific conditions within the study area. And then pivoting off of our calibrated 2018 base year model, CTPS will model future year 2014 no-build scenario. The land use to be used for this scenario will be based on the land use developed for the Boston MPO's current adopted long-range transportation plan for 2040, with the addition of latest land use assumptions as identified by MassDOT and their consultants. CTPS will model as many as 3 build alternatives for which the project team will supply network specifications and transit service plans. CTPS will summarize the effects of these alternatives on travel patterns and mode choice and will measure their impacts on transit ridership and roadway traffic. CTPS will perform air quality analysis and also the environmental justice analysis. Additionally, MassDOT and its consultant team plans to develop an intensive land use development scenario by identifying additional assumptions for future year infrastructure and development and examine possible increases to residences and jobs in this area. This scenario will be used for sensitivity analysis of build alternatives. In this effort, CTPS will coordinate with and provide guidance to the MassDOT's consultant team CTPS's specific role here will be to provide our expertise to study the impacts of intensive development scenario on travel demand and coordinate with the consultant. This effort will involve post-model processing. Everything in this scope is straightforward. The study is supported in full with non-MPO funding. In all, the scope has 18 months timeline and is scoped at $108,664,000. Thank you.
Thanks, Sanjay. So before I open up to questions, can I get a motion and a second to approve the Wellington Circle study scope?
This is Eric Barassa, MAPC. I make the motion to approve the Wellington Circle study scope.
All right, thanks, Eric. Second, please.
Brian Kane, MBTA Advisory Board, enthusiastically seconds Eric Barassa's motion.
All right, thank you, Brian. All right, can I get any questions, people? It looks like 3 people have interest. Do people have questions or are they voting? We know, Jonathan?
We have Daniel Amstutz and Tom Bent. Hold on.
Daniel,
Yes.
you're unmuted.
Yep, thank you. Hi, yes, this is Dan. I do have a question, actually. I am still confused about which circle we're talking about here. I would appreciate if we could have a map of where this is, because I'm getting confused between the one that is Route 16, Fells Way. It's either Route 28 or 38. That's over by, well, I can just think of the landmarks around there. There's, you know, an Aldi and Stop and Shop on that side. And then the other side of Wellington, there's another circle that leads you into the Best Buys, Home Depot, Target, so on and so forth. So I was confused about the presentation and then the memo about where exactly this is. Can that be clarified, please?
Sure. Sanjay, you want to go ahead?
I'm sorry, I did not have a picture of the area, which I can little later furnish to everybody. This is the area of Wellington Circle near the transit station, that area. As I defined in the study area, basically the Mystic Avenue corridor on the west, the intersection of Fellsway and Pleasant Street on the north, and Northern Strand Community Trail and Broadway corridor on the east, and the Route 99 and I-93 on the south. That is the inverted triangle kind of area around the Wellington station that we are going to study.
Daniel, does that help?
I think I still need to see that. I'm trying to look on Google Maps here, and I'm not seeing where all of these intersect all at once. So I'm sorry, I just don't. I'm not, I guess, familiar with the where exactly Wellington Circle is from what we call it. So sorry about that.
All right. Sanjay, do you want to try to find a graphic that you have? You said you have something readily available.
Yeah, I can email it to, I will email a graphic to Jonathan, and he can share it with you guys.
All right.
Just give me 1 minute and I will email the graphic.
Jonathan, do we have anyone else with the hands raised? I know you wanted to talk, right? So go ahead, Tom.
Thank you. Daniel, if this helps, some of the landmarks there, you have, it's where you come out from Assembly Row, go over the bridge. You have Cappy's Liquors there. You know, Best Buy is, you know, a little bit down off, further down, but that's kind of that major intersection right there. The MD, well, it used to be the MDC police station, but now it's the state police station, is also within that circle. My comments are, you know, City of Somerville is very pleased to see this study go forward, but I wanted to see too if we're going backwards a little bit to look at. I know on my time on the MPO, I know at least one other study for Wellington was done, and maybe 2. You know, so I'm showing my age here, but I'm hoping that we're going to, you know, take a look at those studies also to kind of, you know, so we're not reinventing the wheel. I know a lot of development has happened since those studies have been done, but I think it might be valuable to take a look at what past studies had come up with also. So I was just hoping to make sure that people were aware of that and are going to be looking into that. Thank you.
Yeah, Tom, I don't think that's a problem. I can make sure Ethan and Michaela know. There are project managers in OTP, so.
Okay.
All right, I saw that Jay had his hand up. Jay, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say City Everett fully supports this. I'm working obviously with Medford, Malden, and Somerville. We had our first working group meeting yesterday, so happy to see this moving forward. And thanks for including it.
All right, anyone else have any comments or questions?
Seeing none.
All right, Jonathan, go ahead, read the roll.
Okay, Stephen Wolfle.
Yes. Oh, wait. Did Eric, do you guys raise your hands just voting? I saw Eric. Did you have a question, Eric, or are you just voting? Just want to check.
Believe they're just voting.
All right, okay, sorry about that. Go ahead, Jonathan, keep going.
Okay. Marie Rose.
Yes.
John Romano.
John Romano, yes.
Samantha Silverberg.
Yes.
Laura Gilmore.
Laura Gilmore votes yes.
Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane.
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins.
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kadzis.
Tom Cads is yes.
Jim Fitzgerald.
Yes.
Jay Monty.
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis.
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz.
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Sheila Page.
Lexington, yes.
Tom Bent.
Yes.
Thank you, Tom. Thatcher Keyser.
Thatcher Keyser votes yes.
Thank you. Darlene Wynn. I see her hand raised. Matt, do you see Darlene's hand raised?
Maybe having an issue with the unmuting. Oh, unmuting.
I just got the message. Darlene Wynn votes yes.
Thank you. Tina Cassidy.
Yes, Tina Cassidy votes yes.
Great. Jennifer Constable.
Jennifer Constable, yes.
And Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries unanimously, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jonathan. Let's move on to the next agenda item, which is also an action item. It's the Federal Fiscal Year 2020 UPW Amendment 3. Sandy, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning. I am here to request that the MPO vote to endorse Amendment 3 to the Federal Fiscal Year 2020 Unified Planning Work Program. I want to note that there are two handouts to explain this amendment. One is a memorandum with the that includes the summary table you now see on your screen, and the other one is a redlined UPWP document showing all of the changes made in this amendment. You voted to release this amendment for a 30-day public comment period. At the August 6th meeting, we received no public comments on the amendment during the 30-day public comment period. Just want to recap the content of this amendment briefly. It is overall net neutral on the UPWP budget, neither adding to nor subtracting. Traditionally, staff have presented a number of reallocations between task lines within the UPWP budget to the MPO at or near the beginning of the fourth quarter of a given fiscal year. Being able to kind of flexibly reallocate funding with the support of the board is a major benefit to completing all of our work at this point in the year, and gives us the ability to adapt to changing conditions and MPO goals, especially given that at this point we're working off of UPWP budgets that were laid out up to 18 months earlier. We did receive guidance from the Federal Highway Administration this year, earlier this year, that any change of 10% or more to a UPWP budget line must now be executed as a formal amendment rather than an informal adjustment as we have done in the past. Thus, we have this amendment, which moves some money around within the FFY 2020 UPWP, the UPWP as it reflects the changes made in Amendments 1 and 2. Overall, again, it's net neutral. This year, we've had some unique complications related to COVID and the emergency situation, and creating some unanticipated project challenges. But like any year, we're also adjusting to staffing changes, such as staff moving on from CDPS or people taking leave. The total amount of money reprogrammed is $137,500. Again, details are on your screen or in the memorandum. The UPWP committee voted this morning to approve the amendment and recommend that you endorse it. I am happy to take any further questions at this time, and if not, I request that you endorse this amendment.
All right, can I get a motion in a second to approve Amendment 3, and then I can open up to questions, any questions we'll have with Sandy?
Patrick Keyser.
Yes, I move to adopt the amendments.
And Brian Kane.
Brian Kane seconds.
All right, anyone have any questions for Sandy or Ben? All right, seeing none, Jonathan, please read the roll. Oh,
Stephen Will.
Keep going. Steve Will, yes.
Marie Rose.
Yeah.
John Romano.
John Romano, yes.
Samantha Silverberg.
Yes.
Laura Gilmore.
Yes.
Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane.
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins.
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kadzis.
Yes, Tom Kadzis.
Jim Fitzgerald.
Yes.
Jay Monty.
Monty, yes. Jay Monty, yes.
Thank you. David Kozis.
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz.
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Sheila Page.
Sheila Page, yes.
Tom Bent.
Tom Bent, yes.
Thatcher Keyser.
Thatcher Keyser, yes.
Darlene Nguyen.
Darlene Nguyen, yes.
Tina Cassidy.
Tina Cassidy, yes.
Jennifer Constable.
Jennifer Constable, yes.
And Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries unanimously, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sandy. So, we will now move on to the next agenda item, TIP criteria revisions, key takeaways. Matt.
Awesome. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everyone. Give me just a sec as we get set up here. All right, so today I'll continue to discuss the revisions to the TIP project selection criteria with a focus on summarizing the progress we've made over the last several months. In support of this presentation, there is a collection of tables posted to the MPO meeting calendar under today's date. These tables contain a full draft of the revised TIP criteria. Here's the ground that I'll cover during today's presentation. I'll start by highlighting a handful of goals for this discussion, as well as some questions that I hope to answer today in support of those goals. From there, I'll give you all a reminder of what we discussed during our last meeting on September 3rd, when we went over the results of the project test scoring conducted by MPO staff. I'll then move into a discussion of the adjustments that we've made to the criteria from the original proposals presented at past MPO meetings, walking through these by goal area. Next, we'll jump into a discussion of some of the overall takeaways from the criteria revision process, including the progress we've made on the goals we originally set for this work. And finally, I'll briefly highlight some next steps at the end of the presentation before we have a conversation on today's presentation with whatever time remains. So these are our goals for today. First, I want to brief you all on the major changes made to the TIP criteria from the original proposals made to this board. Second, I want to provide you with a self-assessment of the progress that we've made on this project as a whole. And finally, if MPO members feel comfortable with the draft criteria and have no further questions or concerns, I will have the opportunity to hold a vote to endorse the criteria as presented. In doing that, I hope to get your responses to two key questions. One, are you ready to vote to endorse the draft TIP criteria, or do you need further information to support that decision? And two, do you agree with MPO staff's assessment of the extent to which we've accomplished the goals we set out for this project, or do you have any further feedback you would like to share on this front? There's no need to remember these questions, as I'll come back to them at the end of my presentation. So I want to take a few minutes to remind you all of the key takeaways from the project test scoring that we discussed at our last meeting on September 3rd. So here's the general approach that staff took when conducting test scoring using the new criteria. First, we selected a handful of representative projects from the Complete Streets, Intersection Improvements, and Bicycle Network and Pedestrian Connections investment programs. We endeavored to select projects that feature a range of elements and baseline scores to try to understand how different aspects of the new criteria would play out. Then we conducted the test scoring. Again, 3 criteria worth a total of 5 points were not evaluated during test scoring, as this project information wasn't readily available. This is information that we would ordinarily gather during the normal project evaluation process from project proponents and other sources. But given the time-sensitive nature of the test scoring process, that data gathering process was slightly constrained. The projects that we test scored were also anonymized as we talked through the results. This was done to allay any potential fears among project proponents that their projects were being rescored, as well as to keep the conversation focused more on how the criteria are functioning as a whole, rather than the specifics of any given project. We also discussed our plan to move forward with a scoring approach for major infrastructure that applies the most relevant criteria from the other investment programs to major infrastructure projects by type. That means we would apply Complete Streets scoring criteria to major infrastructure corridor projects, intersection improvements criteria to major infrastructure intersection and interchange projects, and the transit modernization criteria to major infrastructure transit projects. There would be some minor adjustments to those base criteria in scoring major infrastructure, but the overall approach would be essentially the same. We elected not to score major infrastructure projects, however, to test score major infrastructure projects, that is, because we don't have great scoring data on previously programmed projects in this category, and staff felt it wouldn't be fair to test score a prospective major infrastructure project at this point, given that we will consider those for funding in the next TIP beginning this winter. I do want to clarify that these proposals for major infrastructure scoring are somewhat independent of the conversation this board has been having with my colleague Ann McGann around how we define and program major infrastructure projects. We will continue that conversation at our next board meeting on October 1st. So there were several key takeaways that emerged from our test scoring exercise. Overall, we saw that scores didn't vary greatly from the original criteria to the new criteria relative to peer projects within the same goal area. There were some adjustments in points based on criteria that were added or removed, but the overall system isn't a wholesale change in how projects score or how they rank relative to each other. In our current system, projects that accomplish a lot tend to score well, and that's certainly no different in the new scoring system. Second, we saw that our revised approach to equity scoring is more fully recognizing all people within a project area, meaning we're accomplishing the goals that we set for ourselves on this front. Third, if anything, the scores that were presented at last meeting are slightly lower than they otherwise would be, as a handful of the criteria were unscored due to data limitations that I mentioned earlier. As we bring projects into the scoring pipeline for the coming TIP cycle, we'll ensure that we gather this additional data from project proponents so that these criteria can be scored fully with the next TIP cycle. And finally, we reduce point values for criteria that focus solely on auto improvements and reduce some of the existing redundancy in this area. We also eliminated points allotted to criteria that scored elements only tangentially associated with the project in question, including points for business improvement districts and points for crashes on roadways that are unrelated to the project in question. On a related note, we also saw increases in points for investments in resiliency and for improving air quality in parts of the region with high concentrations of pollutants, among other increases with new criteria. So I now want to go over some of the key adjustments made to the criteria since the initial proposals were presented to this board throughout the spring and summer. Again, there's a series of tables posted to the MPO meeting calendar that contain the resulting product in much greater detail. Before we dive in here, I would like to give a shout out to the whole certification activities team on MPO staff for their guidance, input, and support throughout the criteria revision process. I've mentioned this before, but I'll say it again. This has been, a long process that's taken over a year, but it's very much been a team effort. And so I really appreciate all the input from my colleagues along the way. I'd specifically like to again recognize Betsy Harvey for all of her hard work on the equity scoring, Kate White for her enthusiasm creating a public outreach process for this project, Anne McGann and Ariel Patterson for their work on the resiliency criteria, and Michelle Scott, who served as an informal advisor on this whole project and who put in a ton of time brainstorming ideas and talking through challenges of all sorts. So I'll walk through most of the adjustments we made to the criteria by goal area, but there are a handful of changes that cut across all goal areas. First, point values throughout the criteria were refined to allow the criteria to fit into a 100-point scale. Second, we adjusted the way that we approach major infrastructure criteria, as I talked about earlier in this presentation. Third, because we made proposals for new criteria one goal area at a time, there were some redundancies that emerged. Those have since been clarified and eliminated as needed. And fourth, the adjustments broadly take into account the feedback we've received from the MPO, the public, and other key stakeholders such as MAPC. In the safety goal area, the criterion for equivalent property damage only, or the measure of the severity of crashes by injuries, fatalities, and property damage, was removed for bicycle and pedestrian projects. This change was made because the methodology for this criterion currently awards projects points for nearby crashes that may have nothing to do with the project, such as a two-vehicle crash on an unrelated roadway. Because of the varying nature of bicycle and pedestrian projects, some are on-street facilities, while others, like rail trails, can be both near roadways and completely removed from roadways. MPO staff felt that this criterion was applying a methodology to projects that didn't seem to consistently fit, and so its removal here made the most sense so that the safety criteria for bicycle and pedestrian projects can more meaningfully focus on what those projects are doing. In another change, staff elected to keep the crash rate criterion as it is in the current criteria, where points are awarded for crashes resulting in injuries, fatalities, and property damage only. The original proposal by staff was for this criterion to change to a measure of the rate of injuries and fatalities only. But given MPO concerns that both the new EPDO criterion that I just talked about and the crash rate criterion were discounting property damage crashes, staff elected to keep this criterion as is to ensure that property damage crashes are effectively taken into consideration in the criteria. Finally, staff made some adjustments in how bonus points are awarded for addressing high crash areas to clarify and streamline the overall bonus point structure within the safety goal area. In system preservation, staff made two key changes from the original criteria proposals back in June. First, staff condensed some of the resilience measures being evaluated, specifically taking points that were elsewhere in the criteria for improvements to culverts and stormwater infrastructure, and moving them here to reduce redundancy throughout the criteria as a whole. Second, when conducting test scoring, staff discovered that the original proposal to measure sidewalk improvements by quantity rather than current condition did not illuminate many differences in the projects, as all projects seem to replace most or all of the existing sidewalk in the project area. Retaining this criterion as a measure of current sidewalk condition allows this criterion to better distinguish between projects by measuring the urgency of project need, and also allows this criterion to remain consistent with the methodology for measuring the replacement of pavement and bridges. In capacity management and mobility, staff made a handful of changes from the original proposals for this goal area. First, we separated the auto and transit delay criteria due to feedback on the methodology for measuring person delay. For transit improvements, projects will still be awarded points for reducing delay by the number of passengers, rewarding higher ridership corridors with more points. For auto delay, staff are proposing to award projects for points for addressing corridors that currently have low levels of travel time reliability. Projects that reduce auto delay would still be awarded points through the air quality scoring, as this measure is the primary input for calculating reductions in emissions. Second, we revised the points we award for new transit assets to remove the points that we had originally proposed for investments that would reduce transit delay, such as bus lanes and transit signal priority, as the impacts from these investments are already captured in the transit delay criterion that we just talked about. Instead, this new transit asset criterion is now focused on investments in new assets that improve the transit user experience, including amenities like new bus shelters and real-time countdown signs. Finally, staff have made some adjustments to how MAPC's local access tool will be used to measure bicycle and pedestrian improvements, removing this from the bicycle network and pedestrian connections methodology because it can only be used for on-street improvements. Moving now to clean air and sustainable communities, staff made 3 key changes to the criteria based on the original proposals presented last February. First, the original proposal had a single scoring scale for all project types. Upon further analysis, however, there were notable differences in emissions reductions between bicycle and pedestrian, complete streets, and intersection improvement projects. To accommodate these differences, staff broke out individual scoring scales for each investment program based on historical results from past TIP projects. Second, in response to feedback from our partners at MAPC, as well as some public comments, staff have elected to swap out our consideration of PM 2.5 in favor of considering nitrogen oxides in the emissions criteria. The goal of this criterion is to reward projects that result in emissions reductions in parts of the region with high concentrations of pollutants that impact health outcomes. NOx is a better pollutant to measure in this case because it's more closely associated with adverse health outcomes than PM 2.5 and is also more localized around roadways, whereas particulate matter levels tend to be more evenly distributed spatially across the region. So this change allows us to really focus in on the health impacts of poor air quality in areas immediately adjacent to major roadways. Third, staff elected to condense the remaining environmental criteria into one singular criterion that measures a range of environmental outcomes, including reducing runoff, mitigating urban heat island effect, selecting project alternatives that protect sensitive natural areas, and increasing access to parks and open space. Finally, in economic vitality, staff removed a 1-point criterion for improving road access to a targeted development site. This change was made for 2 reasons. One, we've gotten feedback from this board and from the public that there should be less emphasis on criteria that explicitly reward points to projects that make auto-only improvements. Second, this criterion was getting awarded to basically any roadway project in a targeted development area, as the threshold for improving road access wasn't well defined. In this way, this criterion wasn't drawing meaningful distinctions between projects and didn't warrant keeping in the new criteria. Now that we've covered the specific changes that staff made to arrive at a final draft of the new criteria, I want to take a few minutes to recap the goals that we outlined for this project back in the fall of 2019 to assess how far we've come with this project as a whole. When we first began considering revising the TIP criteria, we set 5 goals for this project, including creating criteria for the transit modernization program, creating better measures of specific elements associated with different project types, creating criteria that better align with the goals of each investment program, eliminating some of the scoring disparities across different types of projects, and finally, allowing for the best projects in each category to achieve something much closer to full points. In terms of accomplishing these goals, everything was either fully or partially accomplished, which is very exciting. We have criteria for transit modernization projects and have certainly eliminated many of the criteria that projects didn't meaningfully score on, which means the criteria now much more closely align with the types of projects we see in each category. Some disparities still remained across project types when we conducted test scoring, with intersection projects scoring slightly lower on average than complete streets projects. Bicycle and pedestrian projects, however, did see relatively higher scores compared to their baseline scores in the original criteria. That being said, these disparities are likely at least partially a function of the limited sample of projects that were test scored and the specific elements within each of those projects. So some of these disparities may evaporate even further as more projects are scored using the new criteria. And again, as we are able to fully implement the criteria with all the appropriate data that we'll gather during the project evaluation process. Finally, no projects received a perfect score in test scoring, but upon further reflection, the framing of this original goal may have been a bit ambitious. The reality is that no project will likely ever see a perfect score, as we don't expect any project to do everything. That being said, under the original criteria, the highest scoring projects were getting 55 to 60% of the total points. In the new system, those same projects are getting roughly 70% of the total points. Again, that reinforces the idea that we've eliminated some of the criteria that projects weren't meaningfully achieving. When this project began, MPO staff also outlined 5 central principles to guide this work. Those included that the resulting criteria be manageable to implement, make use of the best available data and methods, create balance across investment programs, be both realistic and aspirational, and be clear to project proponents and other stakeholders. As you can see here, we had varying levels of success in adhering to these principles. In terms of implementation, the new criteria are slightly more complex than where we started, though that complexity allows us to achieve many of the goals listed on the last slide that we just talked through. Because of this, we'll give us partial credit on this goal, though the criteria are still very much implementable. We are taking into account new data where possible, such as disparities in exposure to air pollution and goals outlined in municipalities' vulnerability plans. There are certainly still opportunities for growth on this front, however, as I'll come back to on the next slide. And as I noted on the last slide, scores are more balanced than where we started, although there may still be some discrepancies across investment programs. Again, we'll have a better sense of how this plays out as we score much larger samples of projects in the coming TIP cycles. In terms of being both realistic and aspirational, we are asking projects to do several new things with respect to resiliency, transit, public engagement, and other areas, which makes the criteria more aspirational than our starting point. We've also retained many of the basic criteria that plenty of projects reliably accomplish to some degree. And so in this sense, the criteria are still very much realistic for project proponents to achieve. And finally, I give us a mark of fully adhering to our final criteria being clear, as MPO staff are working to roll out a slate of explanatory materials to ensure project proponents and the public fully understand the new scoring system. I'll talk a little bit more about these materials in just a minute. So though we've made significant updates to the criteria through this effort, there are certainly still opportunities for further improvements in the future. First, there's an opportunity to move some of our criterion from proximity-based metrics, like whether or not a project is near an area targeted for future economic growth, to access-based metrics. This would allow for a measure of the extent to which the improvements made by a given project, like adding bike or bus lanes, actually increase the access of residents of the region to jobs and services. As mentioned in past MPO meetings, MPO staff are working with MassDOT staff and the State Smart Transportation Initiative to explore the use of Conveil or a similar software to conduct these analyses. We'll continue to keep the board updated as this project develops in the coming months. Second, there are opportunities to use a similar analytical approach to measure safety, which would allow for a measure of predicted reductions in crashes based on specific improvements being made by a project. MPO staff are in the early stages of exploring this and will keep the board informed as this effort moves forward. Third, because the Transit Modernization Program is still in its infancy and no projects have yet been scored for funding through this program, staff will continue to monitor the types of projects that seek funding and continually evaluate these criteria to assess whether any changes are warranted. And finally, staff intend to follow up with this board in the coming months to continue the conversation from last winter around cost effectiveness measures and any policy changes this board may want to consider when projects see significant increases in cost after being programmed. Though any policy changes here wouldn't be a part of the criteria proper, they're still very much related to the broader project selection process, so we should have a follow-up conversation on this subject before we get too far into the TIP development cycle for this coming fiscal year. As for next steps, if this board feels ready to do so, we can take a vote to approve the draft criteria at the end of today's discussion.
Oh, Matt, can I interrupt for a second?
Yep.
I am not going to allow a vote today because it wasn't listed as an action item. So I just wanted to be clear before we go too far. So it actually has to be listed as an action item. So we'll just need to put it on the next agenda item, okay? Next agenda.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, so if there are still questions or concerns, given that we will be coming back to this at the next MPO meeting, we can certainly take the intervening 2 weeks to address those and come back with answers. As we move into the start of the new federal fiscal year, MPO staff will work to create some supporting materials that will explain the new criteria and help facilitate the project selection process for the coming TIP cycle. So what will these supporting materials include? First, we plan to update the criteria guidebook that we made to facilitate public outreach with the final criteria changes. This will act as a nice plain language summary of the process as a whole. Staff will also update the detailed scoring methodologies for all of the criteria, outlining the scoring by investment program. Updates will also be made to the TIP project proponent questionnaire, which is the principal way MPO staff gather scoring information for each prospective TIP project. Focus questionnaires will be made for each project type. And finally, staff will also explore bringing back the TIP how-to guide. This guide was last made in 2010 or 2011 and was a one-stop shop for understanding the TIP process. Given the changes to the investment programs and some of the complexities introduced by the new criteria, this is an ideal time to consider bringing this resource back in an updated form. So with that, I'll return to our key discussion questions for the day, and I'm happy to take questions or comments with any remaining time that we have. And obviously this first question, we will not be having a vote today, but if there's any more information you would like to see before taking a vote at the next meeting, please do let me know.
All right, thanks, Matt. It looks like Leonard has a question. Go ahead, Leonard.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say more later, but I just want to say that that TIP how-to guide, that's great. I'm really happy to hear that you're going to bring that back, because there was a member of the advisory council who had asked about that, and I'd seen something along those lines when you'd given me a bunch of data relating to how we got to the current criteria a while ago, and that guide was phenomenal. So I'm glad to see us going back to do that. And so I'll come back later for more comments after listening to some of my colleagues here. Thank you.
Thanks, Leonard. Others have questions. Jonathan, I saw a couple of hands raised.
Sheila Page.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Matt, I had a question just about reading the summary table. You have a column labeled type, priority, location, proposed solution. Can you explain what those mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is on the first page of the table that's posted to the MPO meeting calendar, just for folks' reference. So the type is really just sort of a test of a way to flag like the different elements that each of the criteria are looking at. So this is something that we might implement in like in the methodology when we're actually explaining how each criterion is scored. And this is a way to sort of flag for project proponents, like, you know, what sort of things we're looking for with each criterion. Like, is it something that the project is implementing that's sort of a solution to a problem? Is it a measure of, you know, let's say crash severity at a certain location? So that helps us identify priority locations for investment. And then some other ones are titled like expected outcome, which would be doing things like reducing emissions. And so that's something where we actually expect a new outcome from the investment. And so it's sort of a way to just categorize criteria to help proponents sort of understand what different things are looking for. But if you have any, this is very much a sort of a work in progress. And so if you have any recommendations on how to frame those, or if these are helpful, would definitely be interested in feedback.
All right, anyone else with a hand raised? Jonathan, do you see?
Hang on. Do have one from Len.
All right, Leonard, go ahead again.
No one else. So I just wanted to say I agree with your assessment of the goals. And I mean, I know I sound like a fanboy, but I've just been so impressed with the process. And sorry, someone's heard me say fanboy. They're laughing here in the background.
That wasn't here, Leonard. I was laughing.
No, it's here in this room. No, here at home.
Oh, all right.
So yeah, no problem. Anyways, but I've really been impressed with the process. And then when I look at that worksheet, that Matt produced, it really is a beautiful thing. When you just look at all the detail that go into a project assessment, you just realize all the work that the staff put into evaluating projects, and yeah, we can improve it, but I think it's a really good base of work. It's been really a pleasure working with people on this over the last year or so. So that's it. Thank you.
All right. Anyone else, Jonathan? I don't see any hands raised. All right. So thanks for that, Matt. Good job. So everyone should expect to see that the next agenda item is an action item to vote the criteria out. So thank you. All right, John, let's move to the next agenda item, which is performance-based planning and programming update. Michelle Scott and Ben Muller. I don't know who's going first, so whoever's going first, just go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. My name is Michelle Scott. I'm just going to make sure my video is on. Okay. I'm a transportation planner for MPO staff, and this morning I'll be giving a performance-based planning and programming update with Ben Muller from the Office of Transportation Planning. Next slide, please. So just to highlight two high points for the presentation today. The first, back in 2018, you may recall that the MPO voted to support or concur with MassDOT's 4-year performance targets for several federal performance measures. And what's happened recently is that MassDOT has reviewed the 2-year progress on those 4-year targets to determine whether to make any adjustments, which the federal government allows us to do. And so after conducting that review, MassDOT is proposing to update the target for one measure in particular, the percent of non-single occupancy vehicle travel in the Boston urbanized area. Relatedly, MassDOT is proposing to maintain existing 4-year targets for other federal performance measures. Next slide, please. So the focus for the discussion, which we'll move to after the presentation today, is do you MPO members support the proposed change to the non-single occupancy vehicle travel target? Next slide, please. So to set a little bit of context for the discussion, the table on this slide shows the full range of federal performance areas for which measures are established and targets are set. And so all of these performance measures and related requirements are intended to help states, MPOs, transit agencies, federal executive branch agencies, and Congress understand how investments in the nation's transportation systems support the achievement of national performance goals. You may recall for some of our previous discussions around this area, federally required targets like the 1-, 2-, and 4-year targets listed above are short-term and are meant to be data-driven and almost function in some cases more like forecasts than aspirational targets. So that's a piece to keep in mind as we talk today. The specific role of the MPO is to consider how projects and programs that we spend money on help achieve targets for the region or help achieve targets for larger geographic areas. And so MassDOT's focused its recent review on the sets of measures towards the bottom of the table with the 2- and 4-year targets. And in particular, we're going to be talking today about measures that pertain to the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Improvement, or CMAQ program, for which one of them, a 4-year target, is proposed to be adjusted. Next slide, please. So before we talk more about that, I do want to highlight some resources that we have available for getting a full sense of federal performance measures and targets. The first of these is in our Transportation Improvement Program, particularly in Chapter 4, which is our Performance Analysis chapter. And you can read in there a lot of detail about these federal performance measures and trend data for both the Commonwealth, specific transit agencies, and the MPO where we have it available, and the full set of existing state and MPO level targets that we have available. The other thing this chapter does is encourages and includes descriptions of how projects in our most recent TIP may help achieve these performance targets. So I definitely encourage you to check that out. Documents available on the MPO website. The other supporting resource is the MassDOT tracker report and online performance monitoring tool. What this includes is a number of other Commonwealth level measures, targets, and performance data that supports MassDOT and other Commonwealth level agencies' understanding of how the Commonwealth's transportation system is functioning. So these are resources to help you get kind of a fuller picture of what's going on. Next slide, please. So coming back to the CMAQ performance measures that I referenced earlier. So the CMAQ program, or Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Improvement Program, is designed and allocates money for investment in projects that improve air quality and support congestion relief. And so these projects include roadway projects that may help reduce congestion or idling by improving signals or roadway geometry, or projects that may support non-SOV travel options. And the MPO's CMAQ-funded Community Connections program is a good example of the types of projects that fall into this category. So federal measures for the CMAQ program are meant to tell the story about how well the program is doing to help advance these congestion relief and air quality improvement aims. So the measures are shown here at a very high level. The table presented focuses on types of measures, the relevant geographies, and how targets are set. So we'll be talking primarily about the traffic congestion measures today. And these are set for the Boston urbanized area, which includes not only our MPO region, but neighboring MPOs to the north and south of us. And part of the urbanized area even extends up into New Hampshire and a bit into Rhode Island, as I'll show on the next slide. And so according to federal requirements, targets are set for the measures for the urbanized area using kind of a consensus model that involves the state DOTs and MPOs that exist within that urbanized area. And the discussion we're having today is part of that consensus building process. The other measure that's relevant to this program relates to mobile source emissions reduction and focuses on how CMAQ-funded projects that are programmed in areas under monitoring for specific pollutants may be helping to reduce emissions in those areas. So for us in the MPO region, we're kind of focused on a specific area in Waltham that had historically not achieved federal standards for carbon monoxide. Those standards had since been achieved, but we have been required to do some additional monitoring to avoid some backsliding. And so that's an area where we focus on that specifically as an MPO. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to remind you of the geography of the urbanized area, which is shown in green. This is kind of based on aggregations of census tracts and blocks, which is kind of why that has the shape that it has. And as you can see, it extends to neighboring MPOs both to the south and the north of us. Next slide, please. So talking a little bit more about CMAQ traffic congestion measures specifically. So there are two of these that are measured for the Boston urbanized area. The first and the focus of today is the percent of non-single occupancy vehicle travel. And this is measured using data from the US Census American Community Survey that monitors journey to work. Basically, this captures whether people are driving alone or whether they're taking carpools, walking, biking, transit, taxis or rideshare, or if they're telecommuting. And so this obviously doesn't capture all the different types of trips that people are taking using these various modes, but it is the best and most up-to-date way to try to capture information for the full urbanized area that we have available. And this is a measure that we want to increase with the goal of improving congestion and air quality. We want that percentage to go up. The second measure, which we're not really going to be talking much about today, is focused on reducing peak hours of excessive delay for travel on the national highway system. And this is measured with a lot of other data sources focused on travel time data, volumes, and roadway features, with the goal of reducing the amount of time that people are spending in congested conditions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ben to talk a little bit more about the non-SOV travel target, our recent progress, and the proposed changes. Next slide, please.
Sure. Thank you, Michelle. So as you can see here, this chart shows the data that informs MassDOT's proposed revision to the percent of non-SOV travel. So the dark solid line is the actual data from the US Census American Community Survey. When we first set this measure, we had the data up until 2016. And then the lower dashed line to the right is the projection we made off of that data, ending in the current target of 35.1% at the far right in the lower pink diamond. As you can see, the additional data points in 2017 and 2018 show that the percent of non-SOV travel is increasing faster than we initially projected. So the higher dashed line to the right is our new projection based on the new data, with the proposed revised target of 35.8% in the sort of magenta diamond there. So this might seem like a minor increase, but this data set covers a bit over 2 million workers. So that translates to over 14,000 workers changing commutes to a non-SOV mode. And given likely increases in telecommuting and all of the work being done at municipal level to provide safer and more reliable transit and pedestrian and bicycle facilities, we're fairly confident that this figure will be higher than we initially projected 2 years ago. Next slide. So this slide just shows all of the federal measures again for reference. I would like to note that we are also proposing a revision to the mobile source emissions reductions targets for air quality non-attainment areas outside of the Boston region MPO. But within Waltham, we are not proposing a change. All right, and I'll pass it back to Michelle for next steps.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben. And so before we move into that discussion, I just want to touch on where today's discussion fits within some upcoming activities we'll be working on for performance-based planning and programming. As you can see at that top category, today we're focusing on considering proposed changes to the percent of the non-SOV travel target. And, based on the discussion today, at a future meeting, we'll move to a more formal vote on whether or not you want to support that updated change. And then coming in later into the fall and early in the winter, we'll actually be talking about a new performance management area that we haven't discussed yet, which relates to transit safety. And so we'll be learning a little bit more about that from folks who work on that at the MBTA and at the RTAs. And we'll be eventually reviewing and voting a set of regional targets for this area. And also later in the winter, we'll be coming back to some of those performance areas that we've been talking about on an annual basis. First, transit asset management, and also roadway safety performance. And so you can look forward to those discussions and learning more about what's going on in those areas. Next slide, please. So finally, I want to re-raise that discussion question regarding whether you all as MPO members support the proposed change to the non-SOV travel target. And Ben and I are available to take any questions that might help. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Michelle and Ben. As both have said, we're not going to vote on this today. We're going around to all the MPOs and briefing them on where we currently are heading. So with that, does anyone have any questions for either Michelle or Ben? Daniel, go ahead.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's great to see that chart, and I certainly I applaud MassDOT for increasing that target for non-SOV travel. My question is, though, is that still realistic given considering the last 6 months and the pandemic and the much depressed transit ridership over that time and potentially into the future? Is the expectation that things like telecommuting and other, yeah, I guess telecommuting and possibly other modes are still going to offset that depressed ridership, or do you think that's going to change in the future?
Michelle or Ben, do you want to answer? And I think Brian's on. Brian, are you still on? I don't know if one of you want to answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the non-SOV, I don't think we have a clear idea of exactly where we'll be next year. This target is technically for where we'll be in 2021. But I do think we wanted to at least take a nod to the data and the good work that's been done in the past, that this number is rising more quickly than we expected, which is good. And given that we don't quite know where we're going to be as a whole for 2021, but this is sort of a data-driven target, we wanted to stick to the data provided when sort of setting our revised target.
I believe Brian has a comment as well.
Hey, Brian.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think Ben summarized that pretty well. And Daniel, that's an excellent question, because it was the exact question we were actually asking ourselves when we were doing this. You know, if you look at the data point for 2020, because ACS data incorporates teleworking, it's off the charts, right? It's like 50% teleworking. So of course that's not something that we anticipate to continue in the future. But to Ben's point about you know, the telecommuting, and we expect that to increase. I guess, you know, looking at the targets, we do, at least for the interim, are anticipating that to offset any decrease in ridership. But the good thing is that this is just performance period 1 for the federal highway measures, which ends at the end of 2021. So we will actually be setting these measures again on a 2- and 4-year scale in 2022, in which case we'll have a couple more data points. We'll be able to reassess where ridership is at that point. Hopefully, you know, we're in a post-COVID environment by then. I hope everybody that, you know, is hoping the same thing, and we'll be able to have a better assessment where we're going to be in 24 and 26. So we do have another opportunity to come back to these targets then. But for the time being, we thought this would be a good approach for the short term.
Thanks, Brian.
Okay, thanks.
Others that have hands raised, Michelle, do you have yours?
Just really quick, yeah. Matt, could you actually go back to the chart with the target change? Just the one before that. There we go. Yeah, thank you. You know, I think, you know, Ben and Brian definitely covered it pretty fully. Just kind of 2 minor points of context. I don't think that there is like any risk to the MPO or to the Commonwealth or other participating agencies increasing the target. In some cases, there are kind of penalties of some sort for, you know, not meeting a target or coming within or not having improved progress. This is an area where we're showing improved progress, and so I think that's one thing to keep in mind. Also, that the measure mechanism we're using here, we're looking at a kind of a 5-year rolling average. And even as we're moving into that, you know, 2021, where we're starting to pick up the impacts of COVID, which, you know, we're still kind of trying to see where that's going to fall out in terms of increases or decreases in mode share for different modes. we're still, those averages are still picking up the gains that we're making from the previous years. So I think overall, we're still on a positive trajectory. So I just wanted to add those 2 points in.
All right, thanks, Michelle. Others that have their hand raised, either Matt or Jonathan, who's—
Jay Monty.
Hmm?
Jay Monty, sorry.
Go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, no, I certainly support increasing this. I think, you know, I admittedly, when this topic was introduced at the beginning of the presentation, I was fearing that we were lowering it due to the pandemic. But I think it's the right thing to do to keep it, you know, to raise it. And I think even if, you know, there's a year where we miss the target because, you know, of the depressed ridership, I think there's an accountability component here that both to MassDOT and to the communities and to you know, other agencies that, you know, we have a target that regardless of what's happening today, we should still be maintaining that target into the future. One question I just had was, I just keep hearing the topic of telecommuting coming up, and telecommuting is not a mode in this, is it?
Yes, telecommuting is contained within the percentage non-SOV travel.
Oh, okay. All right. So then I really wouldn't see it going down actually with the pandemic. So, okay, thank you.
All right, anyone else have any comments?
Got Leonard.
Leonard, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in assessing the targets, how do we determine the causality? I mean, how do we determine, that any given program or set of programs, the LRTP, actually contributed to the target, setting the target?
I mean, I can speak a little bit to the, when setting the target, the way the Journey to Work data is structured, it's not just, you know, single occupancy vehicle or not, it shows a breakdown by mode. So we can at least get a little more nuanced in how we're looking at where those changes are coming from. So just for this year's data, we found that there was overall maybe a 1% increase in transit ridership over the course of the data that we have, 2014 to 2018. Although from 2016 to 2018, that number kind of leveled off. All of that increase was sort of earlier in the data set. And we have been seeing similar increases in bicycling, and in there's one category that's very non-specific, that's taxi cabs, motorcycles, and other, but that also includes rideshare, and that one seems to be growing pretty quickly as well. So we can kind of tease out by looking at the data at a more nuanced level where those increases and decreases are coming from. How we relate that back to MPO work, I'll let Michelle speak to.
Go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, Len, I want to thank you for raising this. It's an important point, and this is an area where we're kind of always trying to get better. In some cases, you know, for the near term anyway, it really is a combination of, like Ben mentioned, looking at trends and patterns that we're seeing in larger data sets. The other piece is, you know, in some respects really relates to the item that we were talking about previously with respect to the TIP criteria. You know, what are we learning about these projects and what impacts that they may have based on the features that they include or what their goals are, and trying to understand and where it's possible to do that, to quantify what the impacts are likely to be. And we're kind of at the beginning phases of this process where we're good at, you know, taking a look and seeing what a project is likely to do. We're at the outset of trying to figure out how best to quantify that. But I think the MPO in recent years has made a lot of positive gains in trying to move projects in the direction where this target is attainable. And I think our Community Connections program is a really good example of that. I mean, even for fiscal year 21, we have a number of projects focused on, you know, either supporting new transit services like those happening in the city of Newton, or improving transit signal priority in Cambridge and Somerville. So we are doing things now as an MPO that's going to advance improvement in this area. And that chapter 4 that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, gives an example, and more than an example, a lengthy analysis of how we're trying to capture these effects now and how we're hoping to get better at it in the future.
Well, thank you. And of course, the tip, the before and after study that's being done by the UK is going to give us just lots of insights as to how to do this, right?
Yeah, that's something we're always looking at trying to do better as well, in terms of looking at what we can capture about projects. And, you know, I think to date, one of the things we have been able to include is, you know, changes in delay, vehicle delay and bicycle and pedestrian travel. And, you know, as we continue to do those studies, we're going to see what other data is feasible to pick up that we can use to inform this process.
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. I believe Ken has his hand up. Ken?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to remind folks that the information that the targets are based on, the journey to work information, work travel is only about 1/3 of overall travel. And so that's just something to keep in mind, and that journey to work, there's more likely that there's a higher mode split for transit and other non-SOV modes for work travel than for non-work travel. So it's just something to keep in mind, that if this is based on, this is only covering about 1/3 of travel, and transit and alternative modes are probably not overrepresented, but there are higher percentages in work travel than other kinds of travel.
All right, thanks, Ken. Anyone else have anything to say? Seeing none. All right, so as we said, this will probably be up for a vote in October, one of your October meetings. So if you have any questions, reach out to Ben and Michelle, and we'll look forward to talking about this again and hopefully voting next month. All right, thank you both. We're on to the last agenda item, member items. Are there any member items people would like to bring to the board today? All right, seeing none, can I get a motion and a second to adjourn, please?
Eric?
This is Eric Barassa. I make a motion to adjourn.
And Brian?
Second.
So Jonathan, do we usually do a roll for this, or do we just call it?
Normally just call it here.
We normally just call it.
All right. I got scolded yesterday by an MPO member, another one, that jokingly that I should call the roll for this. So all in favor of adjourning, please say aye.
Got a lot of thumbs up here, Mr. Chair.
I guess so. I guess this is the new voting way we're going to do. I hope Ken's fine with that.
Steve, David usually just says without objection. We're adjourned.
All right. Well, we all have our different styles, Roisin. So, all right. Any opposed? All right. We are adjourned. Thank you, everyone. See you soon. Be safe. Thanks, everyone.